analysis, one on SDCs and one on the tax exemptions. And they sort of talk through what we've done so far. We did analysis on each and came up with our recommendations, sort of preliminary recommendations for all the things we'll be talking about, but we want to get feedback on those. So the housing production strategy action 3A is scaling SDCs or system development charges by unit size. And the idea behind this was to change how they're calibrated so that to scale them more closely to units so that smaller units that typically have less impact on public facilities and utilities would be paying slightly less in system development charges, or in some cases quite a bit less. So the idea there is to make it more affordable to build some of these needed housing types that are identified through the previous housing work, but are not seeing much development historically in West Linn. So the idea is by reducing the SDCs, you're making the development more feasible and hopefully better matching it to how much the smaller households are actually using these services. System development charges, many people in this group know, but very quickly, these are charges that are to pay for the additional usage of the public systems by households that are being added, households or businesses that are being added to the community through new development. Today we're just talking about housing, not commercial users, but the basic idea is that if you have a new household, you build a new house, you're adding a new household, and those folks are going to be using your transportation system, your water system, your parks, and so on. And so there is a system to charge them, a system development charge, to help pay for the city's overall systems and help with the addition of new households. All the different types of SDCs, which we'll go over in a minute, what you're doing is have basically a different methodology for each one. And what you're trying to do through those is arrive at the maximum legally defensible charge. You're trying to establish a methodology that says we can't charge more than this, so that establishes what you are going to charge and make sure that the city doesn't get into trouble by overcharging for new development. But important thing to know about SDCs in this context is the cost of the SDC is going to be capitalized or included in the eventual sale price or rent level of the new housing that's being built. So if a city is charging a higher SDC, that's going to have to be reflected in the eventual sale price of a home to cover the cost of that to the builder. West Linn, and the reason I think that this was under discussion during the housing production strategy and has ended up in the list of action items, is that West Linn historically has had high SDCs relative to other cities in the metro area, and at times has had the highest sort of total level of SDCs. And so it costs a lot to add each additional unit to the community. And as we talk about this, we are going to be talking about water SDCs, which are one of the higher SDCs for the West Linn community. But it's important to note that the city right now is in the process of talking about a new methodology for water SDCs that might significantly reduce them. My analysis was done sort of before having that new methodology, and so I'll be talking a lot about water SDCs as if they're very high. It could be that in the next couple weeks they are reduced pretty significantly, but we'll just keep going and keep that in mind. So here is an update. So not all of these numbers are still 100% accurate, but what you see here is that West Linn currently, the total amount of SDCs really commonly has it at the top of the metro area, higher than its neighbors, and some cities are able to charge significantly less per unit for development. This is a breakdown of the current SDCs as they apply in West Linn. So what you see is there are transportation SDCs, water, surface water or stormwater, parks, and sewer. And then you have two additional charges that come from the South Fork Water Board and Tri-City Service District. So for this analysis, we are assuming that you can't, the city doesn't have much control over what's coming from the water board or the service district. So we looked at the city SDCs. And what you see here is that the greatest contribution to the overall level by far is from the current water SDC and the current parks SDC. They both, water right now is approaching $20,000 per new unit, and for parks it's almost $17,000 per new unit. So these are significant charges that are added to the cost of every new housing unit that's built in the community. So what we did for our analysis is we looked at different ways to scale SDCs to by unit size, or to better reflect the occupancy rate of smaller units, is what it boils down to. And the assumption, and this is borne out by data and census data, is that smaller units on average have a smaller number of people living in them, and through that they're going to be using the city systems a little bit less. Fewer people using less water, using the parks commensurately less, and so on. So the idea is that we want to try to reflect that in SDCs so that these smaller average households might be paying less at the time of development. So the different ways that we looked at were by unit type. So that's breaking it down by single family, detached versus attached versus townhome versus multifamily, and sort of setting a different SDC by each type. That's actually, as we'll talk about in a minute, the common approach right now in West Linn. Another way is to look at unit square footage, try to determine how big the different unit types tend to be, and more closely calibrate it that way. Another is the number of bedrooms. That is obviously closely related to the number of occupants in a unit, and other ways to estimate occupancy. So these are all different ways that we looked at and applied to. We basically looked at each of these. As we'll talk about, we ended up having the greatest focus on water and parks because they're the largest, but also because some solutions revealed themselves. But under this current methodology, you'll see it's marked as tiered. So most of these are actually using kind of a tiered system that's breaking down units into sort of crude categories of single family, middle housing types, or duplex through quadplex type of thing, and then multifamily. So as we looked at these, basically what we determined was that for some of these we have no recommendation on how to sort of adopt a better methodology than what's already being used. That's the case for transportation SDCs and surface water SDCs, which are already calibrated to actual usage pretty well. But we did come up with a recommendation for possible changes to the water SDC and the parks SDC, and some smaller changes to the sewer SDC to keep it in line with. Kind of explain that. For the water system development charge, our recommendation is to adopt the tiers that are currently being used for the sewer system development charge. Right now, water SDCs are based on the meter size, but most housing types in Westland are going to have the same meter size. And so there's no real differentiation between if a house is a large house with a ton of landscaping, uses a lot of water, versus a smaller house, maybe a water miser lives there, using much less. They may have the same meter size and they're being charged the same amount for their water SDC. So the recommendation here is to, rather than just looking at that meter size, is to adopt the same categories of housing that are used for the sewer SDCs currently, and that'll add some more tier levels and gradation. So what's recommended, well, what is currently the case is the categories are single family, detached, and townhomes, pay the highest level of SDCs, and then sort of gradually less for cottages or cottage clusters, duplexes through fourplexes, and then multifamily units. So other than, in addition to adopting those categories for housing, for water, we recommend also reclassifying for both water and sewer, reclassifying townhomes as attached middle housing, more akin to a duplex or a fourplex, rather than categorizing townhomes with single family detached paying the highest level of SDC. And then another issue that came up is the issue of detached plexes, which is we're hearing is common in Westland because there are some existing large lot sizes, and because the new state middle housing rules, there's a possibility of building detached 3 or 4plex on one of these large lots and basically building what are single family homes. So it is also part of our recommendation to count those as more like detached single family homes than other types of fourplexes that are attached. So those are our recommendations for the water SDC. Potential further approach you could take is trying to actually quantify the water usage consumption by unit size. That's going to take a deeper level of analysis, both looking at, you're going to need actual records of water usage, plus I think assessor data saying what type of units we're looking at and so on. So there's a deeper level of analysis that could be done there. Bend is an example of a city that did it that way and saw some deeper savings that way. But so our calculations that are included in our memo is that adopting this type of approach by our calculations would reduce the SDC for middle housing by roughly a third, 33%. And for middle family housing units, it could reduce the level of the water SDC by almost 60%. So it would have a big effect on reducing the SDC costs for those types of units and hopefully providing more incentive to build them. The parks SDC was a little more challenging. So the parks currently are using a tiering system, and the and trying to estimate occupancy by unit type. So we tried to look at this in a few different ways. We found that there's more precise data available on occupancy by the number of bedrooms. And so if we could adopt a methodology that looks at units by the estimated number of bedrooms or the actual number of bedrooms, then you could more closely match that to the occupancy in park use. There are some challenges with that approach, which is how best to track bedroom count for new units. We think there probably are ways to game that system while building new housing a new housing development, for instance, trying to kind of obfuscate how many bedrooms you're actually building, what counts as a bedroom, building an office or something like that, or and counting it, something that could be used as a bedroom and counting it as something else. So there are some tricky parts there. The other question that came up is sort of what happens if there is an addition to a home that adds more bedrooms. Is there a way to calculate an additional SDC for that? I think typically there wouldn't be additional SDCs for most types of additions, so that would be a wrinkle. So those are just some considerations on that. Our sort of back of the envelope analysis we did on those changes resulted in some decent reductions, especially for the water SDC, in adopting these approaches, but also for parks. So what you see here, I know there's a lot going on this table, but in the middle column there is what the impact would be for single family detached units. In the middle is the middle housing types, or mostly plexes. And then on the right is what the expected impact would be for multifamily units. So overall, you see there is a possibility to reduce the SDC levels quite a bit just by focusing on these two. And so those are the preliminary recommendations that we have come up with for this item from the HPS. So I know that was a lot of information and a lot of technical information, so I'm happy to answer any questions or hear any discussions or thoughts on those ideas. Does anybody have any questions to start with? We've got a thumbs up from someone.
I was just wondering, Brendan, if you could talk a little bit about like what happens to the revenue overall with changing the SDC collections.
Yes, so we can. So the revenues for all of these things obviously are reduced by some level. That's the point, is to provide a break on the total SDCs for smaller unit types and some of the unit types that have finding it harder to be feasible in West Linn. So in theory, it does reduce the revenue. Really, the reason that these are all identified as needed housing types is because we're seeing less of that development activity. So I think the question is, going forward, how prevalent this is, how large of an impact it might have. I don't, this isn't likely to be half of your housing or something along those lines that is suddenly paying reduced SDCs. It's going to be a smaller share. So that's one consideration. But yes, the idea is to reduce that burden, and so it will have the impact of reducing revenues for those services. I think I mentioned that.
Further to that, and I don't know if it's a question for this group or not, but I do know that West Linn is going through a severe deficit, and I'll be working with the budget committee on that, and just very concerned about what effect that is going to have. And while I'm all for encouraging low-cost housing and affordable housing, I'm concerned, can the city actually afford to do this?
Abby, I would say it's a hard question to answer. If we see a huge rise in the amount of construction of these unit types, we would collect less SDCs from it. It doesn't have any, and I know you know this, serving on the budget committee. it doesn't have any effect on the real problem that we're having in the general fund with our operating deficit, because this is simply construction funds. The very worst case scenario here is we have less money to build needed infrastructure.
That's a concern too, even though it's not
Yep,
the
it is.
operating budget.
It is.
It's a concern. We lower this, I just want to be sure that the city goes into this with open eyes, that we are lowering revenue for construction and
Indeed.
maintenance.
I would also jump in and say, I agree with that concern. I think the baseline level of these types of housing being built right now are so low that we just don't really anticipate, even though obviously we want these incentives to be effective, that even like in, a 2 or 3-fold increase in these housing types being built right now, they're from such a low baseline level that they really wouldn't have a very big impact on revenue. Of course, there's no guarantees. I would also say, if the city changes these SDCs, it's not necessarily a long-term commitment. Part of the housing production strategy implementation required by the state is to have periodic assessments through the 6-year period that this project is for, to see if the changes are actually effective in encouraging and resulting in more of that housing type being built. And if we find that if we were to make these changes and there was a ton of that type of housing being built and it looked like the city revenue stream was really being impacted, there would be like an opportunity to reassess.
Okay. Any other thoughts or questions on this one?
I mean, I'll just chime in and say in other cities that we've met with around tiering SDCs, our concern is kind of what Erica just touched on, where do you incentivize something and the rubber band gets pulled so far one way that you end up having to recorrect and end up putting a larger burden on maybe the more traditional style development down the road. And that burden would be also somewhat unpredictable, right? It would depend on the scale of development and how big of a hole, say, your parks capital fund ultimately finds itself in. But I think opportunities for checking in on this during that period are kind of what we look for.
Okay. Okay. All right. Well, I will keep going, and then obviously, if more questions or thoughts come up on any of these, we can jump back. That's totally fine. The next part of this is the second part of action number 3, also related to SDCs, and that is to consider an SDC exemption for affordable housing and for accessory dwelling units, or ADUs, on existing houses. So the idea is to more significantly reduce the cost for these needed housing types as identified through the previous housing work. And once again, these traditionally have low production in Westland. I think particularly affordable housing, which is difficult to build anywhere. Tax exemptions can significantly help affordable housing projects, which tend to have very complex financing structures, and they tend to need layers of assistance and help. And the consideration for ADUs is a little different. So for affordable housing, you're offering the benefit to try to serve that niche of your community that is just not served by market rate housing, essentially. For ADUs, the consideration is if these traditionally high levels of SDCs are prohibitive for current homeowners to add ADUs to their homes, if they're being treated like just any other new unit. So oftentimes the idea behind an ADU is that it's going to be used for maybe non-income producing usage, maybe a family member or something will be living there. Maybe it will be used for, home crafts or business or something like that. So so when people go about building ADUs, oftentimes I think the thought process is really that they're going to be able to do that for something significantly less than the cost of just building a new house. So the addition of high SDCs, as if it is a new house, obviously is a pretty big barrier that can be prohibitive to getting ADUs built for existing homeowners. So that's the idea there. So there's sort of two different elements here: affordable housing and then the ADUs. There are cost challenges to both, and I think I covered most of these things, but obviously you're trying to increase the feasibility by lowering the cost of these housing types. If the city adopts an exemption, basically these are authorized by the state, and they have different categories of tax exemptions that cities can enact. And if the city does, then that can cover the city's portion of the tax levy. If you go and get agreement of other taxing jurisdictions, then the tax abatement can be more widespread and provide a greater benefit to the builder. Our preliminary estimates of the affordable housing benefit to a tax exemption was that it might reduce overall development costs by 10 to 15%. It's very significant. That could help a development either provide a deeper level of rent subsidy for lower rents, could help them provide more units than they were planning, and it could help the project just be feasible in the first place.
Brendan, sorry to interrupt.
Yeah.
It looks like Trell put his hand up, so I just wanted to see if you had a question,
Sure.
clarifying question at this point.
Yes, thank you. Two questions. So Brendan, I think you're using the term property tax exemption, but the slide is showing SDC exemption. The two are very different in my mind.
Yes.
Which are you referring to?
You know what? I'm sorry. I may have gotten mixed up in my language as I was talking, because we're going to be talking about a tax exemption in a moment.
Okay.
I meant now to be talking about SDC exemption. So what this means is that SDC we were talking about a minute ago that is approaching $60,000 per unit. This is talking about exempting these types of housing from the SDC.
Great. Thank you for that clarification. And let me read it back to you, because I'm really interested in the last bullet here on this slide. You just used the number $60,000. That is what you're estimating is the 10 to 20% reduction in costs of building a ADU. Are we still on
Not
ADU?
an ADU. Not an ADU, multifamily.
Multifamily.
Yeah.
That's 60,000 per unit?
Yeah, it's a little less currently for multifamily because of the tiering system that's already in place.
Thanks for clarifying the data points. What I wanted to say as a developer of affordable housing in the many communities across the state is that this savings is significant. Would be a significant impact to the overall development and would go a long way to making a new construction, affordable housing development more feasible, financially feasible in West Linn with this type of reduction in SDC costs. So I wanted to provide that input. We see this as a very significant component to furthering the development. It's a component that a local jurisdiction can absolutely do and undertake to further the financial feasibility of developing affordable housing in West Linn. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Yeah, so that's good to hear. You're the expert, so that was our sort of preliminary analysis as well, as in it does make a real and significant difference. So some of the considerations of SDC exemptions. So the where to set the affordability level. There are different examples of these kind of programs found all over the state. It's fairly common to either have a partial SDC exemption or full SDC exemption. So there are examples of this. So you can set criteria when you set up this kind of program. One is the affordability level that you'd like to require from the applicants taking advantage of this. So 60% of the area median income is a pretty common one. A little bit higher for home ownership, at least 80%. Some home ownership programs are even at 100%. Just being realistic about what income level you need to become a first-time home buyer. It's obviously more than you need to be an affordable renter. The duration is another question you can set. Some of the examples differ from 5 to 20 years. I think 5 seems like a pretty short time period in return for the benefit of this. So, but the city can consider a range. And then another consideration that came up, and maybe something for us to talk about, is if ADU development in West Linn, if it's happening, how much that's differing from the kind of detached plex development that we discussed earlier. West Linn's just a really interesting market because you've got large lots, you've got high home prices, so you have these forces that are working in West Linn in a way that it doesn't work, that they're not working in many other communities, combined with the new state middle housing rules. So we would want to confirm that if there was an exemption for ADUs, that we're talking about the traditional, what people may have meant by ADU 5 years ago, and not a new sort of solution that's coming about through the middle housing rules that would allow people to kind of game this. So that's just a consideration. Our recommendation is that that the city pursues these actions as they were recommended in the housing production strategy, especially for affordable housing. I think it's an important one with a big effect, and you can consider sunset clause for one or both of these if you want to have an assessment of how it's working and the impact that it's having. So with that, I will move on again to comments and questions about these two items. Are there more thoughts or questions about how these would work? I don't see any hands raised.
Yeah. I have a couple of suggestions.
Mm-hmm.
Brendan, if you could go back to the previous slide. Thank you. So on affordability, the bullet on affordability level of a couple of observations to share. One, I've seen this done by both affordability level and unit type. Here it is outlined by the distinction between homeownership and rental. And I would encourage a thoughtful thinking that through in terms of, single family homes can be rentals, can even be built as rentals. We tend to automatically think of them as home ownership opportunities, but they can also be rentals. Attached row houses, how do you distinguish if those are rentals or home ownership? So just trying, there's this trying to find that space and definition of rental, home ownership, or unit type is always tricky, I find, in these when we're trying to write code or rules and regs. And especially as like the middle housing is encouraging development of more and more cottage cluster, infill, right? And so we're getting way beyond the traditional single family duplex, fourplex, and then everything was above that, right? We're getting into really wanting to promote, all kinds of different unit types into the marketplace, whether or not they're rental or home ownership. You could have a fourplex could be built and set up as a condominium and sold as home ownership units, as another example, right? We're seeing that in Southeast Portland all over the place right now on corner lots, for example. So that's one. The other is in this space, like in planning space, the term middle housing, again, refers to unit type. And I'm in spaces around the state and in Washington where there's the discussion about middle income housing. So we're referring to a targeted income level as you're doing here, but it's higher than 60% AMI. And in some communities, it's up to 120% AMI. So I'd encourage us to think about this, matching this middle housing, which is kind of an infill agenda, to middle income housing, which is a middle income, serving a market at middle income, versus and/or in addition to a market of 60% and below. So if we want to encourage both middle housing and its type, we also want to be considering how to encourage housing priced at middle income buyers. And so lifting this or providing a tiered exemption, you could do 100% exemption for units targeted at 60% or below. You could offer a 50% exemption for units targeted at 61% to 120%. You see what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm.
To further encourage that middle income housing development.
Okay.
When you say targeted, can you say more about what that means?
Can you say that again? I'm sorry, I didn't.
When you say the word targeted, can you tell the group more about what you mean by that?
Yeah, when we're developing housing, either for sale or rental, we're looking at who can afford it. And so we're targeting a certain income level to be able to pay for the units and the projects that we're building. And so that's what I mean by targeting a market band of either renters or buyers.
Okay.
And we all
so
do
does
it.
that,
Yeah.
would that come with like an income restriction or some sort of deed type of situation?
Yeah. So like all anything built at 60% area median income or below is going to be subsidized with public funds, typically from Oregon Housing, or it's a tax credit project. It could be Metro bonds. I know all the current Metro bonds are allocated, but in the future, we're hoping for more Metro bond. And all of those are come with deed restrictions, heavy deed restrictions. And so I would encourage the city doesn't need to come up with a whole additional deed restriction policy or document. These properties at 60% below receiving public funds from multiple sources are heavily deed restricted across the board. And you can, if that's each jurisdiction handles it differently, West Linn could create your own documents to ensure that affordability requirement. But there's at least 3 or 4 other funding sources in that capital stack that also require those deed restrictions. The middle income housing that is now being stood up by philanthropy and private investor funds targeting this 80% to 120% market, they're standing up these funds that encourage us not to use public money, to find private capital to fill the gap. And because it's philanthropic money, it's cheap money, it's like 3%, 4%, right? They understand the need to drop. In Washington, I'll use the example, Steve Ballmer, the former chief financial officer of Microsoft, stood up a $1.5 billion middle income fund. And there will be a deed restriction with the use of that fund. And that deed restriction says essentially, if you are providing affordable housing to an average income level of 53% area median income across all the units for a 20-year term, then you've met the obligations of the intent of the fund and it becomes soft money, not hard money. So that's a space where many of us are trying to pursue and fill and work within. So circling back around to my suggestion of a SDC exemption at 50% for that middle income housing product would go a long way in encouraging that type of investment and that type of development in West Linn.
That's great. Thank you so much for sharing.
So a full exemption at 60% or below, and then a graduated lesser exemption for middle income points. Okay.
Yes.
All right.
That's my suggestion. Thank you.
I just wanted to add a note that I think we'll probably talk about maybe in tax exemption section 2, but another level of nuance is that depending on, what we're pegging the AMI, the area median income to, it's, fairly high in the West Linn area. So if we're using West Linn AMI, that actually maybe, even if we're at, 60% AMI for West Linn, might actually be more like 80 to 120% for other areas. So I guess it's kind of a question of, are we pegging it to like a metro area affordability level or a West Linn affordability level? And if we're using West Linn West Linn area median income, maybe it'll have the same effect of creating that middle income housing from a regional perspective. But I think that's something that can kind of get sorted out in the details.
And Eric, if I can just add, anytime we're working with public funds and we're talking about area median income, it's what's published by HUD. So it's typically like the Portland metro area median income, right? And so that's just what we'll be using. But I love it that you're thinking about, sub-markets like West Linn versus Oregon City, right? It's very thoughtful. Thank you.
Great. Okay, I'm going to keep moving. I think we're kind of close to on schedule here, but I'm gonna keep that up. So good discussion. But we want to move on to the next action item. So we're going to stop talking about SDCs, and I'll try to keep it straight and not get mixed up again. We are moving on to tax exemptions. These are property taxes. And so there's two we're going to be talking about. The first is the low income rental tax exemption. This is what I was saying is authorized by the state. They authorize a bunch of different types of tax exemptions, and cities can decide whether or not to participate. This one is a 20-year exemption, and it can be anyone can take advantage of it, either nonprofit agencies or for-profit developers, or in between. There's another type that is only for nonprofit agencies. This one has a little more flexibility. It is only for rental properties, whereas the other one is for rental or ownership. So that's kind of the one thing you're giving up. But what it does is similar idea to SDC exemption, is you're reducing the costs, in this case, the operating costs over time, by giving a property tax exemption for providing what has been identified as needed housing types, in this case, low-income housing. So there's all the benefits that we've been talking about already for incentivizing low-income housing. One other thing that's worth mentioning is that cities adopting these things and showing these local commitments can help agencies line up other types of funding. So again, really complicated capital stacks and financing structures for a lot of affordable housing projects, and showing commitment and that you're providing one part of that pie can help actually leverage other grants and other sources. Sorry, I was reading Charles' comment. Okay. Some considerations for this exemption program. There is a hard income limit that comes from the statute of 60% AMI. So this is for lower income folks. After the first year that they qualify, their income can grow to 80% of AMI. So this allows people to increase their income and improve their situation without getting kicked out of the housing. So that's the idea there. The city can adopt other criteria that to make applicants eligible for the program, and these things are sometimes number of units and design standards and things like that. We will, when we get to recommendations in a minute, we'll kind of be recommending against adopting a bunch of other criteria, but that is possible. It can be used by all developers, as mentioned, and this is what I was talking about when I got confused earlier. This applies to the tax levy of the jurisdictions that adopt it. So in this case, it would apply to the share of the overall property tax that is levied by the city of West Linn. But that's why it's very common in these situations for the city to reach out and seek partners from the other taxing jurisdictions to try to get enough on board to really increase the impact of these types of exemptions. The law or statute says that if you can get agreement from jurisdictions that represent 51% of the total tax levy, then it becomes a full exemption. So you need the agreement of enough jurisdictions that it's making up a majority of the levy, and then it applies to everybody. So generally, for most people, that means getting the agreement of the school district and the county. So the recommendation here is that the city does pursue this. This is a really big incentive for getting affordable housing built in your community. And as Sherelle mentioned, for, once you get down to a low enough income level, housing development that's getting public subsidies and public help is really the only option there is. The market doesn't provide housing at these income levels. And so that's what this is meant to provide. This gets into what I was just talking about. So we do recommend that you seek the other taxing districts for their agreement. And then we don't recommend a bunch of additional criteria being added, because really that's just sort of adding more hoops and barriers to these developments for them to jump through, instead of sort of keeping it simple and flexible. If there is, if the West Linn would like to see certain things, design standards or other standards for multifamily, you should really be applying that across your zones to all multifamily, and then affordable housing will meet those same standards. So those are our recommendations on that one. And then I was going to go ahead and talk about the other tax abatement program before we get into questions and comments. The second one was this action from the housing production strategy was the home buyer opportunity limited tax exemption, or HOLTE. That term is actually that's commonly used across the state, or it's become that way. That's actually just what Portland named their program under the statute. That's not the official name of what the state calls it, but that's what a lot of people have ended up calling it. It's a 10-year tax exemptions on the improvements to a property, not the land, and it's for first-time or low-income home buyers, and it can be for either new or existing housing. The tax benefit over time is going to the new home buyer and not so much the developer or home builder. So while this can apply to a lot of different types of housing, generally the way that this will play out is that this would be used by affordable housing or middle housing developers who are intentionally trying to provide first-time home buying opportunities or lower income home buying opportunities. You're not going to see so much of general home builders or developers utilizing this, although they can. But the benefit, again, ultimately is going to go to the home buyer and not the builder. The home price limits that go along with this program are up to 120% of the median sale price, but it can be set lower. Income limits are not required by statute, but they can be set. They can be set by the city as part of this program. Generally, you're going to want to look at income limits that are higher for a home buying program than for a rental program. And unit types can be anything that can be sold. So that can include condos or single family home or cottages or anything like that. The city can choose a boundary in which they want to apply this program. Just applying it to the whole city is probably the simplest way to go, but you can designate a special boundary, and same issue with the other taxing jurisdictions. So our recommendations here are that the city pursues this. But because of the nature of West Linn, both in terms of your current sale prices and because of your income levels, is that this program in West Linn, you would set the home price level that is eligible much lower than what's allowed by the statute. So the statute allows you to set it up to 120% of the median sale price. In West Linn, that's almost $900,000. So you obviously don't want to create a program, I don't think, to allow people to get a benefit for buying $1 million home. So setting it at a lower level, we recommend 60%. You might even consider lower than that. That would be roughly $480,000 price level. But that also seems far from cheap, but very little housing in West Linn is changing hands at a price level that low. For single family homes, it's like 4% or less is selling for less than that. So it is, while it still seems like a fairly high home price level, it doesn't apply to much of your current housing. When it says only 15% of current sales are under this level, that's including condos. So you may, as you formulate rules for this program, want to consider a lesser amount for condos so that not too many of those would be qualifying for this benefit. And we recommend an income limit to correspond to the price level we just talked about, the 60% price level. The income limit that would kind of correspond with being able to afford that would be about 80% of the city's median income, or about 100% of the county's median income, which is lower on average. So those are our recommendations for that program. And questions and comments about either of these types of tax exemptions, how they would work?
I'm just going to say, from a progressive sort of people, not developers necessarily, although I don't have anything against developers' perspective, that I really like the tax exemptions. Again, of course, concerned about what that means to revenue for West Linn and our good old structural imbalance in that. But I think if you're going to attract people who have lower incomes to West Linn, that this is a good way to do it. I'd also like to say, although we don't currently have a lot of housing, as you pointed out, under 480,000, but the whole idea of this work that West Linn undertook along with the state of Oregon was try to make more of that housing. And if we can make it attractive to both developers and to homeowners to do this kind of thing, that's where it's going to come from.
Great, yeah. Other thoughts?
I think Trell had his hand first, but then I'll go.
I'm sorry, I just didn't lower my hand previously. Thanks. I put my comments in the chat. Thank you.
Oh, okay. Well, then I'll go. Now I have to think of what I was going to say. There's certainly some talk about both of these programs around in other cities and at Clackamas County level, but I haven't tracked whether any city has adopted the Holte yet. Do you guys know if a city in Clackamas County has done this? And then my second question is going to be about administration of each of these, and I'm sure if I don't know if Lauren has her screen on right now, but is the city responsible for tracking people's incomes on an annual basis? Is the city responsible for making sure the unit is homeowner occupied and not rented? Like, how does all of that work for a small city?
So there is some administrative burden, and I think that was probably a little more difficult with the home buyer exemption. The low income rental housing exemption is kind of benefits from the effect that Trell mentioned, which is that typically there are a bunch of programs at play here, and other programs are tracking the affordability requirements. That may not be the case all the time, in which case you'd have to, have some system of having the property manager certify that the rents are still affordable.
And regarding
wonder what-
adoption around the county or in the metro area, can you share about that?
Oh,
Do you know?
yes, thank you. We do have examples, and I was just looking for that, and I will have to kind of get back to you on that. But yes, there are examples of this. I don't know if in Clackamas County in particular, but we can let you know.
Okay.
I mean, the major ones are Portland, Eugene, and somewhere in my documentation I have a few examples written down. It's not as widely used as rental housing programs.
I would think a lot of this would have to be county level since they're the ones doing the property tax assessments and collecting the taxes and remitting them to the jurisdictions. So
That's what I'm wondering. Partly is like, are they willing to do that? I don't even know.
Yeah, I can speak to that at least partially. All of these opt-in programs generally require a partnership with either a sponsoring agency or a municipality. The way the assessor's office works is we use the statute as a roadmap. If the statute specifically says that the assessor will administer A, B, and C, then we do. If it's vague or it doesn't state that, then we look to our partner to handle that, because these can become a lot of work to administer and monitor, especially programs where you're needing to monitor income levels and things like that. And just to be quite frank, our office is already understaffed, so these can become very burdensome. So really, we would look to the statute. Statute specifically states that the assessor's office will perform a task, then we do that. If it doesn't state that, then we look to our partner.
That's super helpful. I appreciate that. Do we know what the statute says in this case?
The tracking of incomes and things like that should not be on the assessor. They, somehow they'll be notified that that particular property has an exemption, but in terms of tracking performance and things like that, that would be either on the city or perhaps if a nonprofit agency builds the affordable housing, for instance, they might be able to provide the compliance information that they're giving the state for their tax credits or giving to someone else in the system. I don't want to put Trell on the spot, but he may have other more insight on that.
I'm sorry, you caught me reading another email. Ask the question again.
We were just talking about administration of these programs and talking or tracking performance and so on.
Yeah.
And just what that means for the city, essentially.
Yeah. My understanding is, depending on which program is adopted, there are 6 or 8 programs under state statute that are allowed. And my understanding is depending on which jurisdiction we're in and which program is adopted, we are engaging, I think it was shared here, with the county assessor's office, typically on an annual basis, to either confirm that the property still meets the criteria or to seek Some jurisdictions, it's an annual application process, and I believe Clackamas County, and please check my facts here, is an annual application type for, I think we're in the city of Milwaukee, for example, but it's the annual application process is mostly like the verification process, I think. But I think it's all through the county tax assessor office, not engaged with the local jurisdiction once it is set up and established. It's my understanding.
Okay, I'm sorry, I was wrong about that.
That's helpful. I think this is a super interesting policy question, ultimately, obviously, for the city council. I think they would want some thoughts. We'll need to give some specific examples of, what is the property tax generated from a project like this? Why, if you were to choose a sales, all of that stuff. So we'll need to provide some specifics, but I would guess they would be interested in talking about these. I think just to confirm, I think was it Brendan who said that no one wants to give a tax break to $1 million home, even with West Linn prices being high. I think that's definitely true. I think you'd want to come in with a proposal that was quite a bit lower. I don't think we could survive public scrutiny of a tax break on a $900,000 home, even though I do know we don't produce a lot cheaper than that, and even though I do know, what the income is required to buy a home. So, but I think this is all super interesting. And Erica, I'm gonna have to leave at 4:30-ish, pretty close. You might want to just outline for the group like what happens after this meeting, and like where do recommendations from this group ultimately go? Look, there it is.
Thank you, John. Yeah, I was about to do a time check, not to interrupt Brendan. We have about 7 minutes left, and I want to be respectful of people's time. So, real quick, any burning, like 30-second questions before we jump into next steps? Also, this is not your last chance to ask questions. Please reach out to me directly with questions, and I can connect you to the right person. You all have my email, and then I will also redistribute we will probably do some minor updates to the memos that Brendan circulated before presentation to City Council, so we can distribute that as well, that those have some more detail and examples in them. So yeah, any burning questions before I talk about next steps?
I'll just go ahead and say that I agree with what John said about the fact that we would be very open as council to be considering these things. I am concerned or just curious if any of the efficacy of these tactics, what they count on in terms of actual numbers of units produced. Is there a number they rely on?
Are you talking about like target, like goals for how many units get produced?
Yeah. Like, is it the 1,200 or 1,700 number that I'm somewhat pessimistic could even be actually reached with the available land, or does it not matter? Are these not scalable solutions? Let's put it that way.
Not sure if I exactly understand your question, but we have talked about different target numbers because there are some numbers in our housing production strategy, and then the state it has additional methodologies that they're looking at for housing production targets. I think right now the goal is let's try some things and see what happens. And reassess and evaluate. We are kind of not at the forefront, but a little bit ahead of the curve in terms of the timing of getting to implementation of our HPS, where some cities are still adopting their HPS. So there's not a ton of examples out there, but it's certainly something that we would want to track closely and measure against what the goals are to figure out what the efficacy is.
Okay.
I'm just concurring with what Ken said, that, as I was reading the document, which I did before I came in here, it sounds good, but, perhaps someone like Trell, not today, could weigh in on, I would love to see more information about other states, or if not Oregon, measures that have actually produced more affordable housing.
Sure. Yeah. I point you also to the prior housing production strategy document, to also provide more background on each of these ideas. But we can obviously provide more. You mentioned hearing more from experts like Trell, and I just want to point out that that first step here under next steps is to go and talk directly to a number of types of stakeholders who are going to, be able to give us more intensive feedback on the actual implementation. So that is coming, and then we'll get that feedback, do another iteration, and then be talking to you guys again.
Great. So just to wrap it up so we can end on time, I will send out a follow-up email with some additional details, and then also reaching out to see if people have questions, and potentially seeing if some of you would be interested in some stakeholder interviews and participating in some of that, so we can have a little bit more time to get your feedback, and once you're able to maybe process some of this information a little bit more. We're going to be taking that feedback, like Brendan mentioned, to City Council, and then taking their feedback to refine the recommendations and finalize the recommendations, and then bring them back to a council work session in January. And we'd love to meet with you all again in January as well, and then get into the adoption process, which will, believe the grant requires kind of most of the project to be wrapped up by about May of 2027, but the adoption process can continue past then. But this is kind of the general timeline, and we will keep you posted if anything changes. So yeah, thank you all so much for your time and attending and your feedback. We really appreciate it. And yeah, we'll be in touch.
Cool. Thanks, Erica. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.